Right at the exact second everyone assumed the clock was going to run out, the countdown did not just pause, it was quietly reset. And almost in the exact same breath, a second maneuver came in from a completely different direction. Russia reached out to Iran, sending a clear signal that it is ready for whatever comes next. Now, the majority of media coverage is treating these as entirely unrelated developments. They see it as just another delayed deadline over here and just another routine diplomatic phone call over there. But that reading of the situation misses the point entirely. These are not two separate stories. This is one coordinated, synchronized moment playing out in multiple pieces. And if you do not connect those pieces, you completely miss the grand strategy behind it. So let us walk through this very carefully, because what is actually happening is incredibly simple once you strip away all the political noise.
Deadlines do not move without a concrete reason, and timing like this is never, ever accidental. When you line up the delay of the deadline with the diplomatic signal that immediately followed it, a crystal clear pattern starts to form. And that pattern tells you that we are not looking at hesitation from these world leaders. We are looking at massive strategic repositioning right before the next phase of this conflict begins. Here's the first thing you need to fundamentally understand, and it is far more deliberate than it appears on the surface. Donald Trump did not just casually speak this morning. He reset the entire framing of the geopolitical board. In one moment, while speaking to Bloomberg, he clearly stated that the ceasefire now expires on Wednesday evening. That statement alone completely shifts global expectations. But then, almost immediately after, in his conversation with PBS, he escalated the tone drastically. He stated that if no deal is reached, lots of bombs are going to start going off. Just when that sounds like a situation of maximum urgency, he pulls it right back in the exact same breath. He stated that he feels absolutely no pressure and no obligation whatsoever to close a deal within 6 weeks. I want you to think about the psychology of that for a second. In a single window of time, he raises the stakes to the point of imminent military escalation and then entirely removes any sense of deadline pressure. Urgency is manufactured and then neutralized at the exact same time. The mainstream media is reading this as inconsistency. They are calling it confusion, but it is not confusion. This is highly controlled signaling. It is a carefully crafted message designed to land very differently depending on who exactly is receiving it. And if you want to understand why the events that happened next unfolded the way they did, you have to read that initial signal correctly. Now, here's the second piece of the puzzle, and this is where everything locks into place. Sergey Lavrov got on the phone with Abbas Araghchi, and I can assure you this was not a routine diplomatic check-in. The Russian Foreign Ministry did not just confirm that the call took place, they published the specific language of the call, and that language is surgical. Russia reaffirmed its unwavering readiness to assist in resolving the crisis, and far more importantly, its willingness to facilitate agreements that are acceptable to all sides, particularly between Iran and the Gulf Arab states. That is not vague diplomacy, that is strategic positioning. And then Iran's response to Russia completes the exchange. Tehran offered a clear, ironclad commitment to ensure the uninterrupted passage for Russian vessels and cargo through the Strait of Hormuz. What you are witnessing is reciprocity in real time. Russia secures guaranteed strategic movement through one of the most critical maritime choke points in the entire world. And in exchange, Iran secures Russian backing and diplomatic cover for whatever military or political moves come next. Two foreign ministers, one phone call, and both sides walk away holding something tangible and concrete. Now, take a step back and look at the timing of all of this. Trump shifts the deadline and reshapes the pressure dynamics in Washington. And within the exact same 12-hour window, Russia and Iran lock in a coordinated, mutual understanding. These are not separate news stories. They are two expressions of the exact same underlying structure playing out in real time. This is exactly the pattern I have been pointing to. I did not point to it as a lucky prediction about a specific morning, but as the inevitable structural logic of how this entire situation has to evolve. The geopolitical system itself produced both of these moves simultaneously. And if you do not understand that underlying mechanism, then whatever happens on Wednesday is going to look like a massive surprise. But if you do understand it, then what is coming next is not just predictable, it is already actively in motion. Let me slow this down and walk you through this clearly. I want to look at what I said would happen, what actually happened over the last 72 hours, and why absolutely none of this is random. Because if you are only looking at the surface level events, you will entirely miss the deeper logic that is driving all of the players. I said the deadline would move, and it did. I did not say that based on guesswork. I said it because every single deadline Donald Trump has set in this specific conflict has followed the exact same pattern. Each and every one was tied to a hard condition. Keep the Strait of Hormuz open, halt nuclear enrichment, force Iran into total submission. And every single time the clock has run out and the deadline has arrived, those conditions were still unmet. So the real question you have to ask yourself is simple. What happens when you draw a line in the sand and the other side flatly refuses to cross it? You only have two options. You can enforce the line with military consequences that fundamentally alter the global situation, or you can quietly redraw the line and buy yourself more time. And what we have seen consistently since February 28th is not a display of inconsistency. It is a repeated, calculated choice. Because enforcing that red line does not mean launching a limited tactical strike or a symbolic escalation. Enforcing that line means stepping directly into a full-scale, uncontainable conflict with Iran. We are talking about a country nearly 4 times the physical size of Iraq, with a population of around 90 million people, incredibly hostile mountainous terrain, and decades of meticulous preparation specifically designed to absorb, bleed, and resist an American invasion. That is not a short televised war. That is a generational, strategic commitment with absolutely no clear exit strategy. And inside the United States military chain of command, they know there is no clean, executable plan for that doomsday scenario. So the cost of enforcing the deadline becomes exponentially higher than the political cost of simply moving it. And when that calculation repeats itself over and over in the Situation Room, the outcome becomes highly predictable. The deadline moves not as a sign of American weakness, but as a mandatory function of the system itself. Now, here is where the second layer of this grand chessboard comes in. And this is where the vast majority of analysts are simply not paying attention. I said Russia was positioning itself for this exact moment. They are not doing this to fight. They are not doing this to escalate the conflict militarily. They are doing this to totally shape what comes after the dust settles. Because structurally speaking, Russia's role in this conflict has never been about direct confrontation with the United States. It is entirely about making itself unavoidable in any final resolution. And today, Sergey Lavrov made that strategic positioning explicit. He did not talk about mediating a peace deal between Iran and America. He specifically talked about facilitating agreements between Iran and the Gulf Arab states. That distinction is everything. It means Russia is stepping directly into the regional framework that will define the post-conflict balance of power long before a peace deal even exists. This is pre-positioning influence. It is not reactive, sluggish diplomacy. It is strategic insertion. And at the exact moment when the American ceasefire clock is running down, that message is delivered publicly to the world. That is not routine. That is timing with heavy intent. And this is where every single thread connects. What we are watching is not chaos. It is a highly functioning system producing outcomes based on basic incentives and constraints. Russia is executing a strategy I have described many times before, and today is a textbook example of it in action. I call it the absent profiteer. Russia does not need to fire a single bullet to benefit massively from this war. It gains tremendous leverage simply acting as a mediator. It strengthens its relevance in global regional negotiations, and it positions itself as the necessary bridge between competing sides, all while entirely avoiding direct military confrontation. So when you line up the moving American deadline and the Lavrov phone call, you are not looking at two separate developments. You are looking at the same structural mechanism unfolding from two very different angles. And once you see that clearly, the bigger picture finally comes into focus. This is not just about what happened today. It is about who is actively shaping what happens next. Let us start with the first layer of this because it fully explains why Russia has absolutely no reason to rush anything. When the tension around Iran escalated and the safety of the Strait of Hormuz became uncertain, global oil markets reacted instantly. Prices surged aggressively toward the $120 per barrel range, and that single market movement completely reshaped the economics of the entire conflict. Russia, acting as one of the world's largest energy exporters, did not have to act aggressively at all. It simply had to exist within that volatile moment. And here is the profound irony that most people miss. In response to the massive energy shock, the United States actually loosened its pressure on Russian oil flows in a desperate attempt to stabilize global supply. In other words, a war that America was trying to contain indirectly vastly increased Russia's daily revenues. And the geopolitical system itself created the exact conditions for that to happen. Russia did not need to issue threats, escalate tensions, or intervene with its military. It just stayed quietly aligned with Iran, allowed the crisis to panic and tighten the global oil market, and let consumer demand do the rest of the heavy lifting. The longer this uncertainty continues, the longer elevated prices persist. And that translates directly into millions of extra dollars flowing into Russian coffers every single day of the week. This is what I mean by the absent profiteer. Russia benefits on a massive scale without ever stepping onto the battlefield. It does not need a fast resolution. It needs an outcome that preserves this economic leverage for as long as humanly possible.
Now, let us move to the second layer. And this is where the geopolitical chess becomes even more masterful. Sergey Lavrov made a set of statements recently in Beijing that most Western media coverage treated as mere background noise. But in reality, those statements completely redefined the entire negotiation framework. He made it crystal clear that Russia will accept any nuclear decision that Iran chooses, while also explicitly backing Iran's sovereign right to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes. But far more importantly, he revived a very specific, game-changing offer. Russia is entirely willing to take Iran's highly enriched uranium and reprocess it into fuel for civilian nuclear use. That might sound like a minor technical detail, but it is a massive geopolitical power play.
Because what the United States has consistently demanded from day one is control. Washington wants the removal of enriched material under strict conditions that reinforce American oversight and Western influence. Russia's proposal achieves the exact same technical outcome. The highly enriched uranium leaves Iran, but it completely changes who controls the process. If Iran accepts this offer, the nuclear material goes to Moscow, not Washington. That means Russia legally becomes the long-term custodian of Iran's nuclear capacity. They embed themselves directly into Iran's most sensitive strategic infrastructure for years, potentially even decades. And when you step back and truly think about what that means, the global implications are staggering. The core issue that has stalled every single negotiation, whether in places like Islamabad or anywhere else, is the fundamental question of control and trust. America wants ironclad guarantees tied to its own Western system of oversight. Iran flatly does not trust those American guarantees. So Russia has now brilliantly inserted a third path, a solution that perfectly satisfies the technical requirements of the international community while entirely sidestepping the political surrender that Iran refuses to accept. Under this framework, Iran gets to keep its national dignity and avoids handing over incredible leverage to a Western rival. America can still stand at a podium and claim progress because the dangerous uranium was technically removed. But Russia walks away with something far, far more valuable. Permanent, undeniable influence over one of the most sensitive strategic assets in the entire Middle East. And the timing of this Russian offer matters just as much as the content itself. By making this incredibly generous offer public right while negotiations are under maximum pressure, Russia is sending a direct, flashing signal to Iranian decision makers. They are saying there is an alternative out there, and it does not require accepting American terms on your most critical national security issue. That is not passive diplomacy. That is a highly calculated move placed exactly where it will have the maximum possible impact to derail American leverage. Now, here is where the usual counterarguments start to break down entirely. Because when you look closely at what actually happened today, the fine details do not fit the routine diplomatic explanation. The call between Sergey Lavrov and Abbas Araghchi introduced elements that go far beyond the established pattern. Here is the third layer, and this is the one most directly tied to the events of today. Russia is not just reacting to global events, it is actively positioning itself as the sole architect of what comes after the war ends. Look very closely at the exact language coming out of Moscow right now. It is not focused on negotiations between Iran and the United States. Instead, it is heavily centered on Iran's relationships with the Gulf Arab states, countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait. That shift in focus is paramount because those specific relationships will determine who ultimately shapes energy politics in the Persian Gulf for the next entire generation. This isn't just theoretical analysis. Russia already previewed this exact role when it helped broker the historic Iran and Saudi Arabia rapprochement in 2023, a move that caught Washington completely off guard. What we are seeing right now is simply the next phase of that master plan. Russia is preparing to broker a broader regional settlement that will decide whether Iran comes out of this conflict isolated or fully re-established as a recognized regional power with solid security guarantees from its Arab neighbors. If Russia succeeds in that mediator role, it gains something far more valuable than short-term economic leverage. It gains long-term diplomatic supremacy in a region where it historically never dominated. And when you compare that to how America built its own position in the Middle East, the contrast is truly striking. For over 6 decades, the United States relied on massive military bases, sprawling defense agreements, and heavy-handed security guarantees. It is an approach that has cost American taxpayers trillions of dollars and thousands of lives. Russia, by stark contrast, is building the exact same level of influence through perfect timing, quiet diplomacy, and calculated engagement, one single phone call at a time. So, when Moscow reaches out and publicly says, "We stand ready," that message isn't really about stopping the war in that exact moment. It is about ensuring that no matter what happens next, whether it is a ceasefire extension, a signed deal, or a catastrophic return to conflict, Russia is already deeply embedded in the process. The call that happened today, just before the American deadline pressure peaks, is a massive signal of presence. It is Russia making it unequivocally clear: whatever negotiation table forms after Wednesday, we will be sitting at the head of it. Now here is the critical connection that brings it all together. The reason the moving American deadline and the Russian diplomatic call are not separate stories. They are both expressions of the exact same structural reality. America simply cannot resolve this conflict on its own. Not because the American pressure isn't real. It absolutely is. The shipping disruptions, the severe economic strain, the currency decline inside Iran, those pressures are highly measurable and very significant. But there is a massive difference between pressure and decisive breaking pressure. And that gap is currently being filled by external support. Russia benefits economically from prolonged instability through elevated oil prices. China continues to purchase massive amounts of Iranian energy and provides essential diplomatic cover in global institutions. Together, Beijing and Moscow create a formidable buffer that prevents Iran from ever reaching a breaking point where it feels it must accept American terms unconditionally. So when the deadline approaches, it cannot hold in a rigid, unyielding way, because actually enforcing it would mean escalating into a bloody phase of conflict that is far more costly, incredibly uncertain, and prolonged than anything that has already occurred. This is exactly why the decision-making on both sides starts to naturally converge. Donald Trump and his top military advisors understand the astronomical cost of escalation. Russia deeply understands the leverage created by that American hesitation. So the deadline moves, not as an act of retreat, but as a necessary recalibration. And at the exact same moment the deadline shifts, Russia steps forward to reinforce its position, knowing full well that both sides are rapidly approaching a point where outside facilitation becomes absolutely necessary. Iran needs a way out of the nuclear issue without losing face domestically. The Gulf states need a security framework that doesn't leave them exposed to retaliation. America needs to avoid a broader regional war while still maintaining its strategic credibility. Russia brilliantly positions itself as the only answer to all three of these pressures simultaneously and uses that positioning as ultimate leverage. Now, to be totally fair, there is a counter argument, and it is important to take it seriously if we want a complete picture. You could say the deadline only moved slightly, not nearly enough to signal a major strategic shift in Washington. You could argue that Russia's phone call was totally routine, just part of an established pattern of communication that has been ongoing since the conflict first began. Analysts have indeed tracked multiple calls between Sergey Lavrov and Iranian officials over the past several months, and the phrase "stands ready" has absolutely appeared in previous press statements as well. From that skeptical perspective, nothing fundamentally new happened today, just another boring iteration of an ongoing diplomatic process. At the same time, we see mixed signals from Iran. Conflicting reports about negotiations and will they or won't they attend talks suggest that back-channel diplomacy is still highly active, not collapsing. And if back-channel discussions are progressing much further than what is visible to the public, then a signed deal before the next deadline is still very possible. That interpretation sees continuity, not a masterstroke of escalation. But here is the key difference that destroys that counter-argument. Even if each individual piece looks completely routine in isolation, the timing and the alignment of all of them happening together is what completely changes the meaning. The deadline shift, the diplomatic messaging, the strategic positioning by Russia, taken separately, they can be easily explained away by mainstream pundits. But taken together, they reveal an undeniable pattern. And that pattern points to something much larger than a single day's random events. It points to exactly how the next phase of this global conflict is being shaped before the public even realizes it has begun. We can see this in clear, measurable ways. First, Iran didn't just restate a vague political position. It confirmed a very specific operational guarantee: the readiness to ensure the unimpeded passage of Russian vessels and cargo through the Strait of Hormuz. That is not diplomatic filler language to pad a press release. That is a tangible, real-world commitment with immediate commercial and strategic value. In exchange, Russia reaffirmed its readiness to facilitate outcomes moving forward. This is not just two nations showing alignment. It is hard reciprocity. Previous calls over the last few months were about signaling future intent. This call today locks in an actual arrangement. Russia secures highly reliable access through the single most critical energy corridor on the planet, and Iran secures Russian backing at the exact moment when the next phase of this conflict is about to be decided. The second major shift is even more consequential. Lavrov's uranium proposal, stating that Russia will accept any decision that suits Iran regarding its enriched uranium, is now completely fully public. It is sitting directly alongside America's hardline position, which has consistently required Iran to hand over that material under US-aligned terms. This changes the entire negotiation dynamic because now, for the very first time, there is a highly visible third option sitting on the table. If Iran enters talks knowing that Russia is more than willing to take custody of the uranium on Iran's terms, then the entire pressure structure inside that negotiation room is fundamentally altered. It is no longer a binary choice between bending the knee to America or facing destruction. It becomes a strategic choice between competing external partners, and that option is calibrated perfectly by Moscow. It gives Iran something Washington's offer simply does not have: a way out that completely avoids public capitulation. That is not routine diplomacy. That is Russia inserting itself directly into the final stage of negotiations as a highly attractive alternative pathway on the single most sensitive, unresolved issue on the board. And then there is the deafening silence from the United States. No public pushback, no direct framing of Russia's offer as interference in the peace process. No attempt from the White House to reshape the narrative around it. That absence of a response matters immensely, because in a high-stakes situation like this, silence is never neutral. It is highly informative. It suggests one of two very real possibilities. Either the US is blindly hoping the Russian offer doesn't gain traction, or more likely Washington has already quietly adjusted to a scenario where Russia plays a major role in the final arrangement, and America is just prepared to frame whatever that outcome is as a diplomatic success. Either way, that totally changes what the approaching deadline actually represents. It is no longer just a question about whether a deal happens. It is a battle about who actually defines the terms of that deal. At the same time, you are seeing something equally important happening on the Iranian side. Public statements from their leaders project absolute defiance, sending clear messaging to their citizens that they will not submit to Western pressure. Meanwhile, reports indicate intense, ongoing diplomatic engagement behind the scenes. That is not a contradiction. It is a classic dual-track strategy. Domestic political positioning has to run right alongside international negotiation tactics. It has to, because any peace agreement that appears externally imposed by America without the proper internal framing would be totally politically unsustainable for the regime in Tehran. So what looks like a chaotic, inconsistent mess on the surface is actually a highly coordinated balancing act. Now step back and connect absolutely everything. The moving US deadline, the Lavrov phone call, the Russian uranium offer, and Iran's mixed domestic signals. They are not isolated developments scattered across the news cycle. They are direct outputs of the exact same mechanism. A global system where absolutely no single actor can dictate the outcome alone, and where each player is positioning not just for the deal itself, but for ultimate control over what follows the deal. And once you view the board that way, the core question shifts entirely. It is no longer a simple question of will there be a deal. It becomes a question of what leverage does each side actually bring into that defining moment. Because here is the cold reality. If Russia has already given Iran a highly viable nuclear exit strategy, if Moscow has already positioned itself as the indispensable bridge between Iran and the Gulf states, and if the US has already adjusted its own timeline to avoid a war it cannot win, then the negotiation table itself is no longer what it was even just a few days ago. The very structure of the game has changed. And that means what happens next won't just be about reaching an agreement or a disagreement. It will be a fight about whose framework ultimately defines the outcome. And this is where it gets even more important for anyone paying attention. The same structural mechanism that produced today's events does not just stop here. It continues rolling forward. It produces patterns, and those patterns lead to highly observable outcomes. So, over the next 48 hours, your focus shouldn't just be on what is formally announced at press conferences. It should also be laser focused on what isn't announced. Because in complex conflicts exactly like this one, the most significant moves are almost always the ones that happen quietly, completely without headlines. And based on how this mechanism has been operating, the next phase is already forming right in front of us. We just need to watch closely to see exactly how it reveals itself. So let us talk specifically about what happens next. Because if you truly understand the mechanism behind everything we have just discussed, then the events of the next 48 hours are not random at all. They follow a very strict pattern. And that pattern gives us three very specific, highly likely expectations. First, expect that Iran will indeed send a delegation to Islamabad, not because trust has suddenly miraculously appeared, because it hasn't. Iranian leadership has been incredibly explicit that the core issue is not a misunderstanding. It is deep distrust rooted in very real, very recent geopolitical actions. But diplomacy at this high level isn't about feelings of trust. It is entirely about calculating cost. And right now, Iran has clearly calculated that the diplomatic cost of not showing up to the table is far higher than the cost of showing up, even if they know absolutely no deal will be reached. Reports from major outlets, combined with very carefully worded statements from Iranian officials, all point in the exact same direction. The specific language being used by Tehran, phrases like taking all aspects into consideration, is not a sign of hesitation. It is highly calculated diplomatic signaling. It allows Iran to attend the peace talks while fiercely maintaining the internal narrative for their citizens that they are acting strictly on their own terms and absolutely not bending under American pressure. So the expectation here is clear. Iran shows up, but they do it entirely on their own framing. Second, I need you to watch Russia very closely, because Russia is not going to let its advantageous position fade from the conversation at the most critical moment. After brilliantly placing the uranium facilitation offer into the public space, their next logical move is reinforcement. Expect at least one more major statement, likely from Sergey Lavrov or the Russian Foreign Ministry, that brings that specific nuclear offer right back into the global spotlight. The key detail you need to listen for is any explicit reference to Russia's readiness to handle Iran's enriched uranium as part of a broader regional settlement. If that exact language appears again before Wednesday, it is not just repetition, it is confirmation. It signals to the world that this is not just a theoretical option floated in the wind, but something already aligned in principle between Moscow and Tehran. And by keeping it highly visible, Russia ensures that no negotiation can proceed as if that option does not exist. It forces the United States to negotiate in a space where Russia is already deeply embedded in the solution. Third, and this is the most consistent pattern we have seen so far in this entire saga. Whatever happens on Wednesday will be immediately declared a massive historic victory by Donald Trump. And within mere hours of that statement, it will be publicly challenged and dismantled by Iran's foreign ministry. This spin cycle has repeated itself at every single major milestone in this conflict. Grand announcements are made with ultimate confidence and clarity on one side, and then they are immediately reframed, disputed, or entirely denied on the other. So when Wednesday finally arrives, whether it results in a deal, a deadline extension, or a disastrous return to military escalation, the key is not to focus on the initial bold statements from the podiums. The real signal is buried in the details that follow over the next few days. What is actually agreed upon in ink? What is intentionally left vague and ambiguous? And exactly where do the two sides fundamentally diverge in their interpretation of the agreement? That quiet gap between their public claims is where the actual truth usually sits. And when you put all of this together, you start to clearly see the continuity. The exact same mechanism that produced today's developments, the shifting American deadline, the strategic Russia and Iran phone call, the mixed public signals about negotiations, is still heavily in motion. It does not stop at one single event. It keeps generating outcomes based on the exact same pressures, incentives, and geopolitical constraints. So, as we move through the chaos of the next 48 hours, do not just blindly watch what is announced to the cameras. Watch what isn't. Because in massive global conflicts, exactly like this, the most important moves are almost always the quiet ones.